everyone, and good morning to anybody else that's in WA with me. We're here for a session, a webinar on Microsoft 365 Roadblocks and Resolutions. So for any of you that don't know me, my name's Sue Webb. I'm the end user apps product manager at DDLS Australia, and prior to that I was a technical trainer. So I've been with DDLS for 14 years. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer and a Microsoft certified solutions expert in data management and analytics. So recently moved roles from process product manager to end user apps product manager, and largely because of the framework that I'm going to talk to you about today. So what we're going to look at today, we're going to start with a bit of an overview of Microsoft 365, because it's not a term that has been around for as long as people are probably more familiar with the term Office 365. So what does Microsoft 365 mean? We're going to talk about some of the core tools that are used in Microsoft 365, especially those that are used that relate to productivity. And the core tools we're going to look at very briefly are SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive for Business. We'll also talk about the integration between Microsoft 365 and your desktop office tools, so Excel, Word, etc. Microsoft 365 comes with a productivity promise. Microsoft will tell you that if you implement Microsoft 365, that you're going to achieve various levels of productivity and collaboration amongst your staff. But we will see that the reality is not quite meeting that promise. We'll talk about some of the roadblocks that get in the way of achieving those levels of productivity. We're going to have a look at a case study, which is actually DDLS itself. And then we'll have a look at the good practice framework, which came about as a result of our own implementation of, at the time it was called Office 365. We'll see what the lessons learned were from implementing that good practice framework, and then we'll have an opportunity for some questions and some feedback at the end. Though, of course, you're more, as Fernanda said, you're more than welcome to pop questions into the Q&A in the Zoom session, in the Zoom window. So M365, it's the newer, more broadly encompassing name for Office 365. Though the term Office 365 still pops up everywhere, and in fact, when you sign in to office.com, it still says Office 365 in the banner. So Microsoft themselves still refer to it as Office 365 quite a lot. It's a subscription service from Microsoft that gives you access to a suite of both web-based and desktop communication and productivity tools. You get the web-based tools with all of the subscription models, not necessarily all of the desktop tools, though. For most organizations, they have enterprise licenses, and they'll have both web-based and desktop communication and productivity tools. It's a very busy piece of very busy suite of software, I should say. It's not a single piece of software. We've got some tools that you might recognize and others that you might see as fairly new. We've got our classics, Word, PowerPoint, Excel. And then we have tools that only exist in the cloud as well, some of the tools that only exist in the cloud, others that are a bit newer. So things like Teams has been around for 4 or 5 years. Some tools that are on the way out. We're seeing less use of Skype now, especially now that calling doesn't happen in Skype for Business anymore. That's moved over into Teams. Most organizations are using Teams now. But this wheel of Microsoft 365 grows all the time. There's new tools added to it all of the time. We've got tools like SharePoint that allow us to do document management, content management, collaboration. Though a lot of what used to happen in SharePoint now happens in Teams, but SharePoint sits behind Teams. So there's a lot of crossover there. We've got OneDrive, which we use for OneDrive for Business, which we use for personal documents that relate to our work roles. Where we previously would have used shared drives, we now use OneDrive. OneDrive is also related to SharePoint. SharePoint sits behind OneDrive as well. We've got other tools like Power BI. It's actually my favorite of all of the M365 tools. It's a platform that we use for data analytics and for reporting, visualization of data, etc. Now, we get a lot of confusion between the various tools. When do we use SharePoint? When do we use Teams? SharePoint and Teams are designed to work together. So Teams is the core collaboration and communication tool, whereas SharePoint is the core document management tool. Previously, SharePoint was the core collaboration and communication tool, but that role has been taken over by Teams. So SharePoint and Teams should be used in place of shared drives and local drives to make secure, centralized collaboration, communication, and document management possible. OneDrive's a little bit different. OneDrive allows for a company to provide employees with personal storage space that can be managed from a central location. So it's online storage, it's cloud-based storage that's intended for business purposes. It's built on top of SharePoint technology and behaves very similarly to SharePoint Online in terms of the document management. So most businesses that have subscribed to Microsoft 365 use OneDrive for Business in place of home drives or shared drives. Though we do see that a lot of organisations still have those home drives and shared drives available. And so a lot of the staff, they find that a lot of staff are still using those home drives and shared drives rather than using OneDrive. So they might have implemented OneDrive for Business, but the adoption within the business of OneDrive is not necessarily there. So one of the biggest questions that I get asked when I'm doing this type of training is, when do I use which tool? Now, there's no hard and fast rules about this because it comes down to the organisation, and the organisation generally will need to develop guidance to help staff make these decisions. But as a general rule, OneDrive for Business is for files and folders that only need to be accessed by you. With Microsoft Teams, that means we've got files and folders that may also need to be accessed by others within that team. And SharePoint Online for files and folders that may need to be accessed by others within that department or across the entire business. So we can develop some guidance around this, but organisations then need to say, okay, if it's SharePoint, which SharePoint site? When do I store stuff in an enterprise-wide SharePoint site? When do I store stuff in a SharePoint site that only relates to this specific department or this specific project? So even with this sort of high-level guidance, we still need to develop more specific guidance within each organisation. Now, Microsoft 365/Office 365, whatever you want to call it, integrates fully with your desktop applications. So that means I can open a document that's stored in Teams or OneDrive or SharePoint, either in the cloud. I can open it in a web application. If it's in Teams, I can open it in the web application inside Teams. If it's in OneDrive or SharePoint, I can open it in a web application in the browser. Or I can open it in the desktop application and still have it be connected back to that central storage location. If I want to save directly into one of those locations, I can do that too, as long as I'm following the SharePoint site that it's connected to, if it's a Teams site or a SharePoint site. OneDrive you can see from your desktop apps, but the other tools you can't necessarily see. So you can see it's even though there's a lot of similarities and there's a lot of consistency, there's also, you know, like, oh, well, if it's this condition, if it's this situation, this is what you do. So there's a lot to get your head around when it comes to things like document management in these tools. Now, Microsoft themselves will tell you that you should be hitting various levels of productivity with a rollout of Microsoft 365. And Forrester actually reported that a successful 365 adoption, okay, keyword there being adoption, can give businesses an ROI between 127 and 162% within 3 years. So that's the promise of productivity. And again, keywords, adoption, successful. Okay. Just because you've rolled out 365 doesn't mean that people have actually adopted it. The reality of adoption is a little bit different. Now, these numbers are from a couple of years ago. It's very difficult to find up-to-date numbers, and we would expect that COVID has changed this landscape a little bit and forced a little bit more adoption because people had no choice but to use these cloud-based tools because they're working remotely. But prior to that, we saw OneDrive had a fairly high level of adoption at around 60%, but Teams was fairly low at around 36%, and Dynamics was even lower. So that's the reality of adoption relative to that promise that we saw. So what are some of the things that get in the way of a successful adoption of Microsoft 365? What are some of the roadblocks? Now, we're not talking about the migration here, where organizations are moving through a project to migrate from on-prem to 365. There are heaps of resources, there's tools, there's consultants that'll help your migration go smoothly. I'm not here to talk about that. This is not what we're here for, to talk about migration. So let's assume that you did all the right planning and your migration was a success. Now, chances are if you migrated during COVID and you were forced to migrate during COVID because you had to switch from an on-prem workplace, a workforce, to a remote workforce, you might not have had the opportunity to do all the planning that you wanted and to actually migrate everything, and you may have ended up in kind of hybrid land. So that might actually be part of the issue as well, but that's not what we're here to talk about. So let's assume that you did everything right and you've gotten everything migrated. So everything, you've got all of your files off your file shares and they're all sitting in SharePoint and Teams. You've got all of your personal files, everybody's got their personal files off their shared drives, off their H drives onto OneDrive for Business, etc. The tools are all there. So everything's been done right. Technical teams have done their bit. So we should be able to sit back and reap the benefits, right? The reality is generally quite different from that. So what we find generally is, first problem is that people can't find anything. So users can't find anything. Also, nobody knows how to use SharePoint Online or OneDrive for Business or Teams, let alone which tool to use when. So there's two things going on there. One is knowing how to use the tools and one is knowing when to use the tools. Now, if you haven't retired your shared drives, what you often find is that users will still be using your shared drives or using your file shares. And they can still, or they're keeping everything on their desktop, or they've just put everything in OneDrive for Business and they're not putting anything in Teams and not putting anything in SharePoint. We also often find that when people do, because they struggle to find something, when they do find it, they just download a copy of it and work with it offline. And one of my biggest bugbears is that people are still attaching files to emails in order to collaborate. So here I've got this spreadsheet that I need 3 people to work on. So I'm going to send all 3 their own copy of the spreadsheet. That's not collaboration. Okay. Somebody then's got to try and consolidate it. It turns into a bit of a nightmare, even if you've got track changes enabled and so on. So that's not collaboration. It also means that you lose all of your metadata because you're making separate copies. You've got to merge all of the copies back together when you get them all back. It gets very problematic. There's no security around a file that's attached to an email because anybody can then take that email and forward it to somebody outside of the organization and that file's gone with it. There's no security. Another challenge is for your service desk. So your service desk just gets flooded with, you know, how do I do these questions? And I can't find these questions. And they're getting bombarded with those types of questions. And they, you know, just don't have the resources to deal with that when they're also trying to actually resolve technical outages, etc., and genuine service requests. So we're going to talk a little bit about the case study that triggered this framework, and the case study relates to DDLS 365, which is what we call our implementation of 365. So at the time when we went through this, it was Office 365. Of course, it's now Microsoft 365. So you'll probably hear me talk about it as Office 365 because that's what it was when we went through the project. So some of you may know the DD in DDLS used to stand for Dimension Data. We used to be a part of the Dimension Data organization. So Dimension Data were our parent company, and they were going through some changes themselves globally. They were divesting themselves of any non-core business units. And in Australia, Australia was the only country that had a learning solutions a part of the business. So DDLS only actually existed in Australia. There wasn't a DDLS in South Africa, for instance, or the UK or other places where Data existed. Now, Data were not just our parent company, they were also our IT service provider. So they hosted and or managed all of our corporate IT infrastructure. The only thing they didn't look after was our classrooms. We looked after those ourselves. So what they looked after included our CRM, our SharePoint intranet, which was on-prem, all of our file shares, our phone systems, and our Exchange server. So the migration project was, we need to get everything off of Data's infrastructure by a fixed date. Now, most of our corporate content, our files, etc., was either in file shares or it was in our SharePoint intranet. So what we didn't want to do was implement outdated technology. Everything was previously on-prem. We didn't want to set up our own on-prem servers and just migrate everything, just do a lift and shift and basically create a like-for-like structure, but on our own infrastructure. So the decision was made to use Office 365 as the platform. So we had a typical project plan. We analysed the current state, worked out what the desired future state was, worked out what to keep, remove, add and change, and then all of the work was prioritised. So it was prioritised using the Moscow system, so must-haves, should-haves, could-haves, won't-haves. Now, while all this was happening, the project team who were working on this, I was part of the project team. I was the business analyst on the project team, and I was also a subject matter expert for SharePoint. The project manager was also an instructor. So at this time, I was a full-time instructor. The project manager was a full-time instructor. Most of the project team had other operational responsibilities. And the clock was ticking. We were getting towards the sticky end. We had a very specific date by which we had to have everything migrated, and we were getting closer and closer to that date. There was lots of other changes happening in the business at the same time, and those changes also impacted on the project. And what ended up happening was we ended up having to de-scope a lot of the could-haves and should-haves. So the scope then became much more simple. It was basically, let's map everything to its new locations. Let's migrate everything using the migration tools that we had. And we'll do as much testing as time would allow. So that's what we did. And we got everything migrated. And from memory, we got everything migrated on the Monday of the week where the Friday was the deadline. So there wasn't a lot of window there once we'd finished the migration to do much bit more than just do some rudimentary testing and make sure that everything was actually available before Data actually shut down the source systems. Now, DDLS is an organisation. We close for 2 weeks every year over Christmas. The whole business shuts down. And so basically the Friday after the migration was on the Monday, we finished the migration on the Monday, I should say. That's not when we started it. We finished it on the Monday. The Friday of that week was the last day of the year for us. Came back 2 weeks later, and it was what we've now sort of, in hindsight, realised was a perfect storm. So we were all so focused on the migration, and because we'd had to de-scope so many of the things, the should-haves and the could-haves that weren't as time-dependent, that didn't have to be done by that Friday deadline, that we came back and realised that there was still a lot more work to be done. So it was a new year, and with it came new challenges. So we had new owners again. So this was not the people that Data sold us to, it was who they sold us to, who are our current owners, and very happy to report we're probably in the best shape we've been in, very well looked after. We had a new standard operating environment for most staff. And in that standard operating environment was a new version, a new operating system, and a new version of Office. So for most people, they went from Windows 7 to Windows 10, and they went from Office 2013 to 2016, it was at the time. There was a new phone system, which was Skype for Business. So the phones on the desks were gone. We'd gone from phones on the desks to soft phones. We had a new intranet, which was SharePoint Online, and the file shares were gone. So you can imagine that that was quite confronting for the majority of our staff. Now, we're a training organisation. We have a lot of very technically proficient people in our organisation, but we also have a lot of people, like all other organisations, who work in admin roles, who aren't necessarily as technically proficient as, say, our trainers. So this was a big challenge for our business. Now, we thought, we're a training organisation, that training would solve the problems. So that's what we did. So we delivered training sessions. Now, I'm referring to these as product training sessions, and we'll see why shortly, for all 10 internal staff. So we had one of our lead apps trainers come and do sessions for the staff, where she went through what Office.com was, Skype for Business and how to use that, OneDrive for Business, how to use that, SharePoint Online, how to use that. So we'd migrated everything and we'd trained everyone. So we should have been reaping the benefits, right? We should have been able to hit those productivity levels that are in the productivity promise. But the reality was that just about everybody was struggling. And the feedback we were getting on the project team was that the training hadn't really helped. Now, I was, as I mentioned earlier, I was a technical trainer for a long time before I moved into product management. I'm still a trainer, I just don't do it full time anymore. And what we were hearing from our own staff at DDLS was sounding really familiar to me, because I'd heard similar stories from some of our clients while I've been training them. So, for instance, there was a very large mining and resources organisation here in Western Australia, or whose head office is here in Western Australia. And they had done a soft launch of Microsoft 365 about 18 months before I was working with them. And their business, their senior leadership team, couldn't understand why no one was using it. So they rolled out 365 and just kind of said, oh, well, look, it's there. Go and use it. They just assumed that everybody would somehow magically know how to use it. And then they couldn't understand why no one actually was using it. So they didn't send their end users to us for training, which would have been a good thing. But anyway, they sent their functional support team to us for training. And so what I did was develop bespoke training for this organisation, where we had 2 sessions with their functional support team. And it's a fairly large team because it's a big organisation. And I went through in each session what all of the tools are and how to use them. So what Teams is, what Planner is, what OneNote is, what OneDrive, SharePoint, what all of the actual tools are and what they do and how they work together, and what happens when you create this over here and what it creates over there, because these people needed a little bit more technical training than end users would get, because there's going to be supporting it. And during that training, the team lead from that organisation said to me, look, Sue, that's great. You've shown us how to use these products. But how do we know when to use the products? And I said, well, that's up to your organisation. Your organisation's going to have to decide that. And we had a bit of a discussion, and I'd started to draw some diagrams on the board, and that's actually where the framework that we're going to see in a minute came from, was from this engagement. Another scenario, similar sort of thing going on. This was a not-for-profit in the education sector, so very, very large not-for-profit. In their organisation, everybody just thought that Microsoft 365 was just cloud versions of the desktop applications plus a cloud version of SharePoint. That's what they assumed that what it was, that there wasn't anything extra to 365. So we're seeing this big disparity between the reality of the tools and people's perceptions. But we're also seeing, I'm starting to realise that product training is not enough. So talking about product training and process training is that what we're going to differentiate here. So one thing became very apparent very quickly. So DDLS could help our clients with how to use the 365 productivity tools. That's what I call product training. So that's teaching you how to use Teams, how to schedule a meeting, how to respond to a chat with a graphical response instead of text, how to create a team, how to create a private channel, OneDrive, how to migrate content from OneDrive to SharePoint because you realize that it actually should be in SharePoint. I can teach you how to do all of that. All of our training covers how. But then the organizations had to work out for themselves when and why to use the different tools. And that's where process training is so important. So with our own experience at DDLS and with what I experienced with these clients, and there was other clients as well, I've only shared 2 examples with you. From that, I developed the model that then evolved into the Microsoft 365 Good Practice Framework, or GPF for short. So you'll hear me call it the GPF. Good Practice Framework's a bit of a mouthful. So the Microsoft 365 Good Practice Framework is a resolution to many of those roadblocks. So we know that people need training. You are not going to get the levels of productivity and collaboration that you need in your organization without doing training. It's necessary. People need to understand how to use the tools. Whether they do a half-day course that covers a little bit of everything, or they do a deep dive and spend 3-4 days on a specific product, that's a different decision, but they need training. Everybody needs training. So they need product training. They need to understand how to use the specific products. But they also need process training. They need to know when to use OneDrive, when to use SharePoint, when to use Teams. But the training, even with both product and process training, it's still not enough. The business needs to develop guidance. Guidance needs to include things like when and why to use which tool. So for instance, at DDLS, we develop guidance that helps our staff understand, okay, if it's this type of content and it's for this type of audience, then it's going to go in Teams. And if it's this type of content for this type of audience, it's going to go in OneDrive for Business. And if it's this type for this audience, it'll go in SharePoint. So when and why to use which tool, really important, because otherwise people will just go with what they're comfortable with. People either put everything in Teams, or they'll put everything in OneDrive, or everything's sitting on their desktop, literally on their desktop. If you look at their desktop, there's 1,000 little icons on the desktop. So we need the guidance as well. The guidance needs to be based on governance. We need some policies. They don't need to be overly complicated, just some simple policies that support the guidance. And other things that are included in your governance include things like risk management. But even those 3 layers are not going to make the changes stick. So to help that, we need change management. And change management layer wraps around the other layers. So you can think of this as a little bit like an onion. Governance is at the core, guidance is the next layer out, training's the next layer out, and then change management wraps around the whole thing. And the change management is so we can get those changes to stick, so we can get the training to stick, so that people actually change their behaviours. And it's also important that we address change fatigue. And in the change management, that means things like identifying change champions, identifying the people who are going to champion the change within your business unit. So people within the business units, not IT. So if it's finance, get somebody in finance to do a deeper level of training so that they understand the tools and the guidance at a deeper level than other people, and there's somebody within their business unit that they can go to who understands about finance, and they're going to be able to tell them, oh, okay, for that I need to use Power BI, and I need to do this, and I need to connect to that data set, and so on. So it's those change champions as part of the change management that's going to help all of that. So with these 4 layers, the good practice framework, this means that you can get to those levels, and it won't happen immediately, but it means that you're progressing towards those levels of productivity and collaboration that are really going to allow your business to grow and, you know, take away a lot of that they take away a lot of the how do I calls from the IT, let them get back to what they should be doing, you know, developing and rolling out new processes and things. It's generally a work in progress. We'll talk a little bit about what we can do to help you implement the GPF. So just to talk about this in practice. So I came up with the model. It didn't quite look exactly like this when I first came up with it, but I came up with it when we were going through the DDLS 365 implementation, and we were having all of those problems with staff still not being able to find anything, not knowing how to do anything, constantly hitting the IT desk, being really unhappy with the training, etc. So I came up with this. I went to our senior leadership team. I drew it on a whiteboard in front of some of the senior leadership team and said, this is what I want to do. And they went, brilliant, go and do it. So we put the GPF into practice. So we went and collected all of the pain points from staff, and then that gave us the product training requirements. And from the training scope, we could determine what guidance was needed. So we worked out, you know, we needed guidance on how to classify content and what could be shared and with who. That's another big challenge in 365. OneDrive and SharePoint, you can't share from Teams, but you can go from the Teams environment into the SharePoint site behind it and share from there. The rules on sharing in OneDrive are different from the rules on sharing in SharePoint. But who are people actually allowed to share with? And what happens when you share? There's a lot around that, around security and risk that we need to cover off as well, and that the GPF can help with. So that's what we did. We worked out what the pain points were. We worked out what guidance was needed. We then worked out once we knew what guidance was needed, we knew what governance was needed. So we needed a content classification policy and a content sharing policy. And then the change management piece, that's ongoing. So we then we delivered the training, we gave people the guidance, we made sure that the training matched the guidance. Okay. We developed the governance, so we had those policies underlying the guidance. And then we've got the change management piece, which is ongoing. So things like with change management, we've got Microsoft 365 champions within the business. We also include Microsoft 365 training in our induction process. And we continue to deliver lunch and learn sessions. So about twice a year, I'll do a team session because things change in teams all the time. So I'll do a lunch and learn and tell everybody in the business what's changed in teams or what's new or any new tips and tricks that I've learned. And we have other people come and deliver sessions on other aspects of it as well. So the lessons that we learned from our rollout was that the project is not finished when the migration finishes. The migration is only part of the project. We also learned that users don't just need product training, they also need process training. We know that process training needs the elements of the GPF to be effective and for the changes to stick. And I guess the tagline from all of this is that Microsoft 365 without governance and guidance is chaos, and it really is. I used to say that about SharePoint. When I taught SharePoint, I would say SharePoint without governance is chaos, but now I say it about 365 because it's more encompassing, and it's not just governance, it needs guidance as well. Now, there's a few things that can help you if you're wanting to embrace the GPF. First of all, we've got an eBook. So there will be a link coming out in the next newsletter, and Fernanda will also send a link to this out to everybody that's on this session. So it's an ebook that it's a guide to end user adoption, and it talks about the GPF in there. And we've also got a GPF consulting service. So we're launching a new consulting service. So this is for organizations to address the multiple products that sit within that space. So whether you need to build a change management program, whether you need to develop the rules around the tools, create a document library, whatever it needs to be. So I'll be the lead consultant in this space, so we can help you with that. Or alternatively, you can come and do some training with us and then do it yourself, basically. So couple of things. One, we're building a Microsoft 365 document management workshop. So it's going to be a one-day workshop. It's going to leverage the GPF to help you understand the differences and similarities between the three main collaboration tools, and then guide you through how to do document management in each, because it is not trivial and it's not the same in each. And then we're also developing a GPF workshop. So it's also a one-day workshop that's going to guide you through the GPF itself. So what each element of the GPF is, how to implement it, and then you'll get some templates and examples from that as well. If you're on this call, you can get 20% discount for either of those workshops. Just contact your account manager and quote GPF webinar to obtain that discount. Okay. Doing pretty well for time. We're getting close to that 45-minute mark. So there was a question in the chat about Office 365 certification to be needed as a desktop support technician. I'll have to take that question offline. The Office 365 certification is related to the technical training that we do, and that's not the training that I deliver. But we can get an account manager or someone to get back to you on that one. So Fernanda, I'm guessing we can access these questions after the session.
Yes, we can, Sue.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments, feedback? I'll stop sharing my screen. So someone asked me what the major pain points were in terms of process or products. So for us, for our rollout, I guess the pain point was that we focused too much on the technical aspects of the migration and not so much on the user aspect. We weren't sort of thinking about it with a change management mindset, which would have put more emphasis on the impacts on the users, and we would have been more aware of how many changes we were rolling out all in one go, and the fact that it was over Christmas and that people were going to come back after Christmas holidays and be expected to do their work but have nothing that they recognised. The products themselves, once we got the right training in place and we delivered once we set up the guidance, that was much smoother. Thanks for your question, Eva. Any other questions or comments? No, I think we'll leave it there, Fernanda. So thank you for anonymous attendee. Thank you for your feedback. Hope everybody got something out of that. We will, as we said, we'll be in touch and get some information through to you. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you, everyone.